and welcome to Leave Us Alone, the podcast that champions individual freedom and limited government. Those two go hand in hand. This is Grover Norquist, and today we're diving into taxes, the one big beautiful tax bill, and some of the budget cuts, spending reform, that we're looking to reduce the cost of government and make it easier to further cut taxes. So, Mike, can you introduce our many special guests?
Sure.
Give us a sense of what's coming.
We have a packed room today. We have Ryan Ellis with Center for a Free Economy, and we've also coerced Isabelle Marchese to join us to talk about Medicaid today, joining both me and James, our normal participants here.
Okay. Who wants to? Well, I'll start with the tax fight. The president says he wants it by July 4th. I can't remember if it's the 4th or the 5th. Actually, I think they picked the 4th because it's easier to remember than the 5th would be, and a harder date to run over, particularly if you want to go on vacation. People may remember that when we tried to do this 8 years ago, we didn't get the bill passed and signed until December 22nd of 2017. It didn't take effect until January of 2018. And so when we had some really good growth in 2019 that was very strong and middle class really benefited, that was shortly after we lost the elections in November 2018. If we'd had the tax cuts sooner, not even more and better, just sooner, the Republicans might well have held the House, Senate, and President Trump could have been president for 4 years instead of just for 2 years. It's no fun being in the minority. People impeach you. So, timetable, the House says they're going to get out for Memorial Day, end of this month, and the whole thing will be wrapped up because they've been talking to each other so much, House and Senate. Even though the president's dropped some last-minute good tax cuts in on top of things, I would have appreciated seeing them, 6 months ago. So we could have been working with the House and Senate on them, but better late than never, and progress. So, Ryan, could you walk through with us some of the specific things that people talk about a lot? Some people say, I'm going to be talking about Medicaid in a moment, that Medicaid is going to be the big sticking point question. Some say it's the deductibility of state and local taxes against your personal income tax, SALT, personal income tax, SALT. What is that? How did it come about? How real is it? How many Republicans care? How many Americans care? And how do you see it playing out, holding things up or not holding things up?
Well, the best way to think of this is to sort of break out a little bit. Before the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, before we passed tax reform back in 2017, about 1 out of every 3 American families did what they call itemizing their deduction. So you add up your state and local taxes, your mortgage interest deduction, your charitable contributions, and you put all those together, and that's your deduction. The other 2/3 did what's called the standard deduction, which is the government says, well, you don't have to do all those adding up. Here's a basic number you can use instead. Tax Cuts and Jobs Act doubled the standard deduction. So in so doing, we went from about 2/3 of Americans taking that standard deduction to over 90% of Americans taking that standard deduction. So today, most Americans do not have to worry about the state and local tax deduction or the mortgage interest deduction or the charitable deduction. The standard deduction captures it for 90% plus.
90%.
90% plus, if 91 is the actual number.
Okay.
So that means 10 out of 11 Americans that are filing a tax return do not have to worry about this question at all. So what is the state and local tax deduction? State and local tax deduction is an itemized deduction for those that do choose to itemize. And it says that you can deduct state income tax paid or state sales tax paid, pick one. You can deduct property taxes on your home. Tax Cuts and Jobs Act said, well, we're going to take that and we're going to overall say that you can deduct up to $10,000 of state and local taxes paid. Some people got their nose out of joint and said, well, wait a minute. I remember before Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, I didn't have any limit on how much state and local taxes that I could deduct. If I was one of those people itemizing, I could deduct all of my state and local income taxes paid and all of my property taxes. So what gives? The problem is that wasn't true. As I said originally, 2/3 of people didn't even bother itemizing deductions before Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, so they didn't care about it. Of the few that were still doing itemized deductions, many of them were captured in what's called the alternative minimum tax, or the AMT. There were 5 million households that used to pay the AMT. And the AMT is a parallel, bizarro world tax system where you calculate your taxes one way, the normal way, and then you calculate your taxes the second way, the alternative minimum tax way, and whichever one of those two results in a higher tax is what you pay.
Quickly, who invented the AMT and why did it come in?
The AMT came in the late 1960s, was where it originally started, because there was apparently some report that a few hundred at the most.
I believe it was either 115 or 155. I keep seeing those two numbers.
Something like that is the story, that there were high-income taxpayers that, due to various deductions they were claiming, had zero income tax liability. So Congress decided to put this backstop in called the alternative minimum tax that said, we're going to deny deductions to you, and as a result, high-income people won't be able to escape the income tax. Well, by the time we got to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, that 115 or 155 people had grown to 5 million people. And those 5 million people lost a bunch of deductions and had to pay higher taxes. One of the deductions they lost if you were trapped in the AMT was the state and local tax deduction. And this was primarily for people in New York, people in New Jersey, people in California, people in more blue areas of the country were trapped in this AMT. And they didn't actually have a SALT deduction at all. They thought they were deducting all of their state and local taxes. They weren't. They were deducting zero because they were trapped in the AMT. And what the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act did, by basically repealing the AMT in all but name, they moved 5 million people from a zero SALT deduction to a $10,000 SALT deduction. She gave them more SALT deductions than they had originally.
And yet there are Republican elected officials in California and New York who are quite convinced that their constituents are taking it in the ear because, they've lost this deduction. Is this the press manufacturing this false sense of it? Is it Democrat mayors who want to go back to benefiting from being able to raise taxes as a mayor or as a state governor and say, oh, this won't really cost you that much because Uncle Sam's going to pay for a chunk of it?
Well, I think it's all the above would be the answer to that. You have some people that most people don't know how their own taxes work. And especially if their taxes were complicated and they were paying the AMT, they're going to see over here that I'm deducting state and local taxes. And over here, it gets disallowed. And it's just too complicated for normal people to understand. That's not their fault. Secondly, the press was lying. Back in 2018, the press wanted to defeat Republicans and put Democrats back in power. And there were all these stories at the time about how people in the Northeast were paying higher taxes as a result of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. That was never true. There were lower rates across the board. Standard deduction doubled. Child tax credit doubled. The AMT went away. People across the board, even in New York, New Jersey, California, blue areas of the country, overwhelmingly were paying much lower taxes than they were before. And so you put those two together, and there's been this urban legend that's been created in some areas of the country that I used to have this unlimited SALT deduction. I no longer do, and therefore my family got screwed. You never had an unlimited SALT deduction. You were probably an AMT payer. Your SALT deduction was probably zero, and the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act actually raised your SALT deduction from $0 to $10,000 a year.
Is this written down in one place that we could hand to some of these legislators?
People have tried writing about it over and over again. I've done it in National Review in my column. Others have tried to do it. I think the problem with a lot of the Republicans you're talking about, and there's really only a few of them in Congress, but in a tight majority, a few matters.
Yep.
This is more of a political problem for them. I heard somebody call it a totemic problem for them, is a fancy word to use. It's more of something that people feel like, and oftentimes the feel is more important than the think or the know.
And Ryan, to that point, I think there's been some great data out this week showing that of the top 50 congressional districts impacted by SALT, only 6 of them are held by Republicans. The other 44 are Democrats. The problem is, as you mentioned, is those 6 Republicans were in a 3-seat House majority. There's been some discussion. We've seen some legislation introduced by Mike Lawler that addresses the alleged marriage penalty, which would essentially take the current $10,000 cap and double it for households for married couples to $20,000. Do you think that's a potential landing space of where Republicans might come down? Or I guess part of the frustration here has been we're not really sure what their ask is.
Yeah, the Republicans who are supposedly concerned about SALT have not really made a firm ask lately. Last year, when we were taking a look at another tax bill, they made a stink about SALT, and they said, okay, well, here's what we're willing to do. We're willing to take it to $20,000 for a married couple and with an income cliff. So if you make more than $500,000, you don't get that $20,000. You're back to $10,000.
Oh, I didn't know they'd offered a cliff.
Yes, that was part of that amendment last year. which was a very reasonable place for them to land, I think. I don't think anyone would necessarily begrudge them of that. But unfortunately, this year, they have recognized the leverage that they have, that they are, as they call themselves, the majority makers, that they are the difference between us passing a bill and not passing a bill. And they seem hell-bent and determined to try to maximize that leverage. Part of that is they don't want to negotiate with themselves. They're not willing to say what it is that they actually want. And they are trying to get concessions made by the House Republican leadership, by President Trump and others, to come to them. And they're still in that position.
Well, and if their view is their votes are needed, they should wait until the very last moment to see how much money's on the table. And they go, oh, that's what we're looking for, that number, not the old number. Although that number may be less than they were willing to deal with before. They may find themselves crowded out.
Very well could be.
Yeah.
Now, while we've got Ryan here too, definitely want to ask you about the other side of the SALT coin, and that's SALT for businesses, for both corporations and non-incorporated businesses. Can you talk to us a little bit about how that differs from individual SALT?
Yeah, it's a completely different issue because businesses, unlike individuals, pay taxes completely differently. So if you're an individual and you're paying property tax on your house, it's based on where you chose to live, and you're paying property taxes on that house, for example. If you're a business, you could be a business in a red state, for example. You could be in a business with a state that, for instance, has no income tax, and you're paying a lot of state and local income tax because your customers might be in New York or in California or New Jersey, and you have to allocate your state and local taxes based on where your customers are buying your product or your service from. So businesses don't have a choice. This is a mandatory tax that they have to pay based on where their customers are. It's an ordinary and necessary business expense. For corporations, being able to deduct corporate income taxes paid to state and local governments has been in the tax code since the beginning of the corporate income tax. For flow-through businesses, those are S corporations and partnerships and more sort of complex LLCs, they have been able to pay taxes at the entity level since the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in the conference report had language in there that made it clear that the state and local tax limit on individuals was not to be construed in any way to prevent S corporations and partnerships from being able to pay their business taxes on the entity level. So 36 states, since the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, have put in, they're called PTETs, pass-through entity taxes, that allow S corporations and partnerships to pay taxes tax deductibly at the entity level the same way that corporations do. That the only thing that those two things have in common with the individual conversation we're having about is that those are state and local taxes, but they are not at all the same dynamic. State and local tax deductions for individuals are really subsidies to blue states in order to make everything more expensive there. State and local taxes deducted by businesses are just another ordinary necessary business expense like rent or salary or paper clips.
I think part of the frustration here too, that this is even being discussed at all, has been that President Trump campaigned on cutting the corporate rate lower, cutting taxes for businesses lower. So you wanted to go to 15% for corporations, and you get the discussion floating around on business SALT, which the Tax Foundation has put out a great study on, saying this is effectively a 2 to 3% rate hike. For specific industries, it gets even worse. And they narrowed this down, and we've even seen Trump tailored his rate cut to more of a discussion about cutting corporate rate for manufacturing specifically to increase U.S. manufacturing capacity. However, if you did corporate SALT, if you did business SALT, it actually hits the manufacturing industry harder than any other industry.
It absolutely does, because, and this is true across all industries. It's true for corporations, it's true for S corps, it's true for partnerships, it's true for all types of industries. Nobody went into this year saying we're going to raise taxes on businesses. Nobody went into this.
Yep.
People went into this saying we're going to prevent tax increases on families and businesses, and we're double down and do some new tax cuts for families and businesses. Nobody said they were going to raise taxes on companies.
Well, the cardinals in the Vatican may be in a conclave, and we really feel like we're in our own little conclave here in this room right now. And if you'd like to join our conclave, and if you're enjoying the conversation, please take a moment to rate and review Leave Us Alone on your favorite podcast platform. It helps us reach more listeners who care about freedom. And don't forget to share this episode with friends who value liberty. Now, back to the discussion.
Okay. And everyone who joins us gets to have a vote on the next pope, if I understand your comparison there. Anywho, I am cheered by the thought that the president has talked about a 15% rate for businesses in manufacturing, because I think it's opening the door to 15% for everybody, that whatever is done this time around for a few on the theory that they can't afford to do more on some of the new ideas. I'm hoping that we, good guys, Republicans in the legislature and Congress, can make sure that those steps in the right direction lead to further steps. That if you go to 15% for some people, that's an obvious argument, 15% for everyone. Even if you went to 17 is on the way to what the president had said he wanted, which was 15. And just whenever you take these steps forward on tax cuts, we need to look like somebody who's playing billiards, to the next shot. What are we laying up for the next time around? What are we leaving out, maybe on purpose, so that we can pick it up next time around? I had a conversation with the Speaker of the House who said, this is not the last rodeo. This is the first rodeo. This is one tax cut using reconciliation this year now. There will be 2 more before the election in 2026, because you can do them every year, and the years are not calendar years, but fiscal years, which end in September, like going to school. And this gives us an opportunity to immediately, once we decide what happens here, to merely go and pick up all the tax cuts that fell off on the side and didn't get in the sandbox and line them up again to get first in line next time around, or to think about how to make them a cohesive whole. Why these 6 tax cuts are really the same thing if you put them into one package. I think people should be using bifocal vision, looking at today's tax cut this next 2 months, but then also keeping an eye out for what follows.
And Grover, I think we've talked about here, I think in the tax base, the SALT area is the last thing we're trying to focus on here and nail down before I think we start to see some product and then the House start to pass something here. The other huge area outside of tax specifically has been Medicaid and what the Energy and Commerce Committee is tasked with. I think we've talked about here before, under the reconciliation instructions right now, they have a job to go out and find about $880 billion over 10 years of deficit reduction. A lot of that is going to come from fixes to our Medicaid system. So we're excited to have Isabelle with us today to talk about more about Medicaid and what reforms are being considered.
Hello. So just to set the stage a little bit, Obamacare expanded Medicaid eligibility to include basically any adult earning 130% or lower of the federal poverty level. And now in 40 states and DC, virtually any able-bodied adult of working age can receive Medicaid benefits. So since the early 2000s, about 70% of the increased federal Medicaid costs have come from that Obamacare expansion enrollment increase. And today, Medicaid spends more on able-bodied adults than it does on people with disabilities or seniors or pregnant women or children. And 60% of those able-bodied adults don't work. So obviously, there needs to be some improvement made here. This is a completely different program than most Americans think it is. So some things that are being discussed are work requirements. That could bring us in about $260 billion. The benefit there is obviously labor participation, like we're giving people a path to employment. But also something that's under-discussed is the fact that these able-bodied adults on the program divert care away from the people who need it the most. So there's only so many doctors who are actually taking in patients who are on Medicaid because the reimbursement rates aren't keeping up with inflation. And that's largely because of the financial strain that able-bodied adults put on the Medicaid program. So basically, we have these people on Medicaid who are competing for care, many of which are on waiting lists. I mean, since Obamacare, about 22,000 people on Medicaid have died on those waiting lists. So
How many?
22,000 people since Obamacare was passed.
Wow.
So work requirements help save money, put care back towards the people who need it the most. Some other things that are being discussed are more regular eligibility checks, make sure that the people who are on the program are supposed to be on the program. The same goes for illegal immigrants on the program. There's also going to be some reforms in those areas. And something that I think Ryan can speak to a little bit is limiting provider taxes. I think he had a great way of illustrating this when I was talking to him earlier.
It's a scam. It's a laundering scam that most states, unfortunately, have started to adopt, which is, let's say that you're a state government and you have providers. Let's pick on the hospitals because they're probably the worst example of this. Let's say you have a hospital in your state and you tell the hospital, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to tax you and you're going to pay me, let's call it $1,000. It's obviously a lot more zeros than that, but for our example, we'll call it $1,000. You, the hospital, are going to pay me, the state, $1,000. But don't worry, I'm going to spend that $1,000 on your hospital, on sending Medicaid recipients to your hospital. And when I do that, because of the way that the Medicaid system works, the federal government is going to kick in 50, 60, 70, maybe as high as 90% match on that $1,000. I'm going to get extra money, and guess what I'm going to do with some of that extra money? I'm going to also spend that on your hospital. So we all get to win. The hospital wins because you're going to get more money after all this little scheme is done. I get to win as the state government because I have more money to play with. The only people that lose are the other 49 states, which is great, except that all 50 states are doing it. And so the actual losers are federal taxpayers, all of us who have to pay taxes and are the victims of this little card shark game they're doing.
Some of my favorite Republican governors engaged in this because it's just so tempting to take this free money theoretically comes from other people. But as long as the law allows this to happen, the other 49 states are looting your state.
Right.
Wow. And that's not a good bet on how to organize. Is there an effort in the reforms we're looking at in this reconciliation package to ban this in the future or undo it going backwards?
Well, as Congress says, this is a dial, right? You can turn a dial all the way up to full volume and ban it entirely, or you can turn it all the way down and not do anything about it. They're probably going to end up somewhere in the middle. It's going to be whatever the politics of this will bear, given the size of our majority, given how much the states are going to squeal when we start to do this. But one thing to keep in mind is that someone no other than Barack Obama in his own budgets turned the dial on this. This is Barack Obama in his budget suggested limiting greatly the ability of states to do this, because even Barack Obama back in the 2010s knew that this was bad, knew that this was wrong, and knew that it was a problem in Medicaid.
Do we know how they were going to do that? What
Precise
piece of the dial?
calibration out of the top of my head.
Or how much money they plan to save?
This would be a couple hundred, right?
So what people are discussing right now, we don't have language yet, but it could raise about $600 billion over 10 years.
That's
which would be a huge portion of that 880.
To change the law about how to get more money.
To limit the provider taxes, yeah. We don't have language on it,
yeah,
of course.
The dial could go in any number of directions. It could, I mean, you could go as high as $1 trillion if you jacked it all the way up to the right.
Well, again, since there are going to be 3 bills, if you take it up and, as we suspect, people leave because they're asked to go get jobs rather than stay on welfare, in effect, or they have to be a citizen, or the state doesn't have the option to steal more money out of the federal taxpayers, you could do some of that and then come back in 6 months, in a year. Come back every year from now on to dial it down after people look foolish claiming the world would end if you didn't continue the status quo.
That's right. And these things, in politics, as you know, there's the concept of ripening. Something has to be ripe as an idea. And maybe when you only have 220 House Republicans, you just can't quite get there. Maybe next year, when these guys are a little bit less concerned about everything else in the bill, you can get to it. Maybe when they're up against a deadline, maybe when you have more House Republicans, you can come back and do some of these things. But it's important to socialize these ideas now so that they're in the pipeline and they're ready to be used later.
Well, I think we should return quickly to the work requirements that Isabelle was outlining too, because one of the things we know what the Democrat attack is going to be on this bill is going to be the claim that Republicans are kicking people off of their health care in order to cut taxes for the wealthy and for large corporations. So let's even deal with just the first half of that accusation. Isabelle, as you're pointing out, I think it's a basic conservative position that all able-bodied people who can work should work, period, let alone to stay on taxpayer-funded health care.
Yeah.
So,
and by the way, this isn't kicking people off immediately. This is giving them the ability over time to prove that they're looking for work. Or, by the way, it doesn't just include working for money. This can also include retraining yourself, going to a community college, volunteering. Like, those are all things that are encompassed in work requirements. So there's no reason that you can't be going down to your local soup kitchen a couple hours a day and getting by this requirement. You just have to be a productive member of society. That's basically all we're asking of people.
Just get off the couch.
Yeah.
If you get off the couch, you can probably stay on Medicaid. It's not that hard.
Yes.
But there are so many people that are hell-bent determined to stay on the couch, watching the Rokus all day, that it apparently does save quite a lot of money.
Yes.
Yeah, it shouldn't be a measure of success of how many people we have on the Medicaid payrolls. What you want is to get these people going to work and then not dependent on government.
Right.
This was Jack Kemp, former Republican congressman, leader on budget, on reducing taxes and so on. He said, look, the measure of how compassionate you are is not how many people are on welfare, but how many people get off welfare and are able to take care of themselves.
And for some reason, we have this distorted view of what voters think about Medicaid reforms. And in reality, work requirements, for example, have 81% support among voters. So the idea that this is some scary reform that Republicans should not touch or else they're going to lose their seats, that's completely false.
All the Republicans voted for this back in 2017, prior to that, they voted for this when Ryan had his bill to block grant a lot of these programs, and nobody lost an election.
Well, maybe I can get Ryan fired up here too, because part of the Republicans should feel very comfortable fighting on this ground. I think even going back to past reforms that Grover was just mentioning, go back to the Obama years, where this is the pajama boy fight.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. This is, you had the Obama administration put out their own ridiculous messaging and image of the whole message of you can shop for government health care in your pajamas on the Obamacare exchange, which has led to widespread conservative mockery of the pajama boy. And I think we're having that same discussion here, where this is about, if you're a young, able-bodied man in your 20s, the idea that you should just be allowed to sit around on government having taxpayers fund your health care is ridiculous.
Yeah, and even going back to the 96 welfare reform. Remember, this was a debate on whether we should have lifetime limits and work requirements and all this stuff back in 96. This is not a new debate inside the conservative movement, and it's pretty settled conservative value-based policy that if you're able-bodied and able to work and you're childless and there's nothing stopping you from getting a job, get a job.
Gingrich pointed out that Republicans began winning the welfare debate when they stopped saying what they used to do is, we recognize that welfare helps people, and we recognize that you want to spend a lot of money, Mr. Democrat, but we're kind of cheapskates. We don't want to spend as much money helping people as you do. When the debate changed to welfare is hurting the individuals that you think you're helping, welfare is breaking up families, welfare is destroying neighborhoods, welfare is hurting these people because they're not going out and getting a job and taking care of themselves, and it's unhelpful to the person and the families and the neighborhoods that you think you're helping, we're going to stop you from doing all this damage. That's what made the left go nuts, but it also is what made them fold when President Clinton signed, third time, Republicans passed it, signed the welfare bill because he was told by his brilliant pollsters, this is a loser for you. And if somebody as clever as Clinton couldn't figure it out, I don't understand why we don't see that the left can be defeated on this issue, not strengthened by this issue, but defeated.
And obviously, the other great negative effect of the welfare state is that it has 27-year-olds putting on pajamas, apparently. So we're just asking you get off the couch and find a job. And if you're not physically able to do so, you're not going to lose your coverage.
Because then, by definition, You're not able-bodied.
Exactly.
We're talking about able-bodied, childless adults sitting on their couches watching Roku all day.
Exactly. So as we're talking, a lot of these Medicaid reforms will help raise up to $600 billion. They have to get to $880 billion in the Energy and Commerce Committee's bill. Another piece of that, of course, is going to be spectrum auctions. We've talked a lot about this on this podcast, but basically the government owns a lot of radio frequency spectrum that is used for wireless communications. DoD sits on a lot of it. As we say, they're sitting on eggs that never hatch. And if DoD wants its $100 to $200 billion spending increase in this bill, which is another aspect of it that we don't talk about very much on this podcast because it's not really what we work on, but it is something that they're asking for, they should have to pay for it by proffering up spectrum they don't use very efficiently, finding efficiencies, finding areas that they can move equipment, they can recalibrate. And, you know, frankly, if their equipment doesn't work because somebody else is using a radio frequency spectrum in a foreign country where they use spectrum differently, then it doesn't seem like it's going to work in theater if they're ever at war. So they got to find a way to make this work and relinquish it so that the FCC can auction it. And that's currently projected to raise between $86 and $88 billion. That is with 600 megahertz of spectrum going up for sale. It would, if we want more than that, it looks like it's going to have to be more that they proffer up, but we'll see what agreement they come to. With great direction and leadership from the White House, which is always necessary on these things, DoD has come to the table, and so they're working out how we're going to get to that $880 billion number with the combination of Medicaid reform and spectrum auctions and a few other things here and there. One last item I wanted to mention before we sign off this week is there is more than just reconciliation going on. There is an important bill moving in the Senate side that we are overdue in talking about. And this is stablecoin legislation. So both the Senate and the House have put forward legislation to govern stablecoins. This is a form of cryptocurrency that is pegged to the US dollar. So it's not a regulation of Bitcoin. It's not even a regulation of Dogecoin. It is coins that are pinned to the dollar. And so the regulatory oversight the U.S. government, the Federal Reserve, has over the dollar extends to some extent to these coins. So this is a way to legalize them, to bring them into the system, the financial system, make it easier to trade them, treat them as the commodities that they are. And obviously, the stablecoin issuer industry is very much on board with these efforts and have been working with Congress to bring them into the regular course of commerce. Obviously, we're not pro-regulation, but we are pro-legalization of things like this that can help facilitate more commerce in the future. The Senate is expected to vote tomorrow on the first procedural motion to advance their version, which is called the Genius Act, and it's pretty good. But in the House, there's a version called the Stable Act, and it's even better. And there's one major difference that is worth elucidating.
So if you pass them both, it's stable genius?
A very stable genius.
Okay.
But there is one difference that will need to be reconciled between the two houses, and we think the House version is better than the Senate version. And this is known as the tether loophole. So basically, there is a loophole in the Senate bill that if you are a stablecoin domiciled outside of the United States is not regulated the same way as stablecoins domiciled inside the United States, the House bill would cover everything pegged to the US dollar. This difference is going to put a bunch of stablecoin issuers at a competitive disadvantage or encourage them to leave the United States, which would not be good for investment and for capital formation in the United States, which, of course, we are trying to encourage through tax policy, through spectrum policy, and through stablecoin legislation. So that's something that we hope they fix. It's called the tether loophole because the most famous stablecoin that is outside the United States is called Tether. It's tethered to the dollar. So we encourage senators to consider making this fix. It may pass and have to go to conference if the House version passes as well, but we will cross that bridge when we come to it. But this is something worth keeping in mind and reaching out to your elected representatives to make sure that we reconcile this difference and do it in the right way.
Okay.
So we can have a very stable genius.
Well, that is it for today's episode of Leave Us Alone. Thanks for tuning in. If you found this discussion valuable, please rate, review, and/or share the podcast. It helps to reach more freedom-loving listeners. And we will be back next time with more insights on protecting your liberty. Until then, I'm Grover Norquist, reminding you to cherish your freedom and keep pushing for a government that simply leaves us alone.